Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, and welcome to Then and Now. I'm your host, Ben Zdencanovic. I'm a postdoctoral associate at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. For this week's episode of Then and Now, we'll be focusing not on any one specific historical question or topic, but rather on a single man, J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was the director of the FBI for 48 years, a tenure that spanned 8 presidencies. In the process, he became a central architect of federal power and one of the most important federal policymakers of the 20th century. His fierce campaigns against communism and his antipathy to the civil rights movement also led to some of the most egregious abuses of civil liberties of his era. We are honored to have on our program today Beverly Gage, professor of 20th century U.S. history at Yale University and the author of G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. Among the many awards that this book has already received are the LA Times Book Prize in Biography, the Bancroft Prize in American History, and the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in Biography. Beverly, welcome to Then and Now.
Great to be here, Ben.
So, the first major biography of J. Edgar Hoover in several decades. Tell us what brought you to this project originally. How did it grow out of perhaps earlier work that you had done? And why this figure? Why did you choose J. Edgar Hoover?
Well, I first encountered Hoover as a historical character when I was working on my last book, which was a history of a bomb explosion, a terrorist attack on Wall Street in 1920. And Hoover was there as a very young man. He hadn't become head of the bureau yet. He was just the head of a little tiny organization called the Radical Division within the Justice Department. And a couple of things struck me at that point. One was that what he was saying as a 24-year-old in 1919 and 1920 was the same stuff that he was saying as a 77-year-old, by the 1970s. And so I thought that that was a really sort of fascinating story, particularly around the persistence of anti-communism, anti-radicalism as one of the big themes of the 20th century. And then in the process of doing that work, I started reading a lot of the existing literature on Hoover, much of which was very good, but even at the time was already getting a little bit old. There were all sorts of new fields of history that were coming into being, new records that were coming out. And so those things made me think maybe it was time for a biography.
So that brings us to the question of biography as a genre. What did the process of writing this book, tell you about biography itself and how it can be a lens for broader historical structures and questions and processes?
Part of what was appealing to me about Hoover as a subject is that he is also a vehicle, right? He's a vehicle into a set of themes and issues that were very interesting to me. Anti-communism, the relationship between the federal government and kind of grassroots social movements, a whole array of things that kind of animate me as a scholar. And I think any biography that I would want to do would have to have both of those pieces together. So in the end, I really liked doing biography. I think biography is a very accessible form. I like reading biography. I think it's a very human way of relating to what can often be, big abstract questions about the past. I would say the downsides of biography, or the biggest downside for me anyway, was the kind of imperative of completism, which is to say, one reason that biographies tend to be pretty long is because you can't skip things, really. If it was important to your subject, it has to be important to you. whether it's actually the thing that lights you up or not. And so, in my case, I ended up learning a lot about things like Nazi espionage and a few other things that I would not have said on the surface were that interesting to me, but they were critical to his story. And so I had to take them on and figure them out.
So what does the story of Hoover tell us about federal power and how it operates? As you say in the introduction, where, often when we think about political history, we think in terms of, often presidential administrations. Recently historians have kind of, challenged that idea and encouraged us to look more in terms of broader political orders, the New Deal order, say. But I think what your book shows, among many things, is that a figure like Hoover, who really he was in office for he was the director of the FBI for almost 50 years, most of his adult life, over broad, huge changes in the American political landscape. So, what can we make of that? What does Hoover tell us about federal power and how it's changed over time?
Yeah, this is a book about federal power, and Hoover is a great vehicle for that theme as well. He was born in Washington. He died in Washington. He's this kind of pure creature of Washington when it was, as it is now, the federal city, but was much more distinctive during his lifetime, right? DC residents could not vote. They did not join political parties. And so he's this sort of pure creature, not of politics, but of government, right? And of the world of government as it really transforms from the late 19th century when he's born into the 1970s. So the city of Washington and its growth and its concentration of power is part of that story. But I guess in terms of federal power itself, there were a couple of different pieces that I wanted to take on. So one was simply that this is about the growth of federal power, the dramatic growth of federal power that sort of happened alongside our usual cycles of elections and such, in particular the executive branch. I wanted to bring the story of the security state and the New Deal a little bit together, particularly in the periods in which the FBI is coming into being, because the moment that the social welfare state is beginning to expand is, of course, the moment that the security state expands at the same time. I think the FBI was very much a New Deal alphabet agency. It's when it gets its name and its identity and it expands, and to think about some of those intersections, and then to think about the ways that federal power shaped possibilities and constrained possibilities for ordinary citizens on the ground. So a lot of what's interesting to me about Hoover is his interactions with a whole variety of political movements and organizations on the left, to some degree on the right, and to think about the ways that, this one man and his methods of surveillance and his own particular ideology, had there been a different figure in that position, right, the fate of many of those movements might have been at least somewhat different.
And one thing that I did not know was that one of Hoover's one of his first jobs right out of college, he got a law degree at George Washington, and his first job was at the Library of Congress. And you make a very interesting argument that early experience kind of informed the ways that he, kind of approached fighting crime, right? It was informed the ways that he, thought about gathering information, managing information. And yeah, I wonder what that tells us about the sort of rise of the modern kind of administrative state during this period, the ways that he's kind of harnessing new ways to think about information itself.
Yeah, he has this sort of happenstance in which he ends up working his way through law school by taking this job at the Library of Congress. And it happens to be the moment in which they're sort of putting the finishing touches on the Library of Congress classification system. Right? So you had these two kind of competing library systems, the Dewey Decimal System, the Library of Congress classification system. And that was sort of cutting edge information technology of the time. And he's being trained as a very young man in what were, essentially cutting edge techniques. And though we end up having this picture of him as a lawman and the pictures of him with the Tommy guns and all that, he was always just a paperwork guy, right? He was not an investigator. He was not a policeman. I mean, he did have a law degree. So he was, a lawyer in that sense. But really, he was an administrator and a bureaucrat and an organizer of information and an organizer of institutions and other men. And that's where his strength was. And that's kind of, he happened to be born into a moment where those were becoming valued skills. And then he was in the right place at the right time when suddenly that's what the government wanted and needed.
So if we think about Hoover as primarily an administrator, an organizer, what can we say about his sort of personal political views? I think one thing that often comes across in the book is that his personal politics can sometimes be kind of somewhat ambiguous, even sort of contradictory at times. So at the end of the day, what did you make of where Hoover stood on the traditional political spectrum of the 20th century, or did he stand sort of outside and beyond it?
Well, the book tries to put him in kind of two political traditions, which I think both in the historical literature and then in our politics at large don't tend to be thought of as going together very well. So one is a tradition that he was raised in that kind of saturated the world of progressive era Washington, which was, a progressive ethos that really valorized things like professionalism, federal power, kind of white-collar work, nonpartisanship, career government service, expertise, science, right? All of these things were buzzwords for Hoover, but they were also things that he tried to put into practice in his own way. And I think he was a real believer in them. Administration, expertise, science, right? All of that progressive era ideology. And then on the other hand, he had a deep, deep conservatism on a whole host of social issues in particular, on race, on religion, on communism and anti-communism, on law and order. And those were very deeply held beliefs as well. And what Hoover did was basically combine those two traditions. At a certain point, I say he took the tools of the liberal state to, enforce a conservative worldview. And I think that pretty much captures the scenario. But I think in a lot of instances, these two traditions are sort of at war with each other. So there's some really interesting moments in which, though he's kind of a sympathizer with the white South and with segregationist views, because he's a federal lawman and actually does believe in, federal power and in a certain kind of law and order, he's going after groups like the Ku Klux Klan or engaging in anti-lynching campaigns. And so, it's kind of depending on any given moment and any given issue, what the mix of those traditions is going to be.
So Hoover at the end of World War II, you say was kind of a celebrated kind of cultural figure in the United States, right? It kind of came out of the Dillinger gangster era, cops and robbers, sort of era of the 1930s, gained quite a bit of, cultural cachet in the American imagination. And then by the time he died in the 1970s, you say he was a much more sort of controversial figure in a lot of ways. So what changed over time in terms of Hoover in the American sort of cultural imagination?
I think Hoover is actually a pretty good barometer for thinking about the rise and fall of a certain kind of Washington consensus or political consensus. Now, of course, that was never a universal thing. There are all sorts of ways in which consensus can be seen to be fracturing. There's lots of conflict always in American politics. But in the 40s and 50s, particularly around anti-communism, law and order, which are his two big issues, he has enormous support from all over the political spectrum, ideologically, in terms of partisan affiliation, from the White House down to the grassroots, right? Public opinion polls give him popularity ratings in the 70s and 80s and even 90 percentiles. And so he is this figure who stands for something that lots of people, Democrats, Republicans, presidents, Congress people, want to support during that period. And I think what you see happening in the 60s is both that he's getting sort of older and less effective in managing his own career, but also that, you know, a lot of that just fractures around questions of race and civil rights, around the war in Vietnam. And so as the country's politics polarize a little bit, Hoover then becomes much more closely identified with the right in a way that, you know, I don't think people would have described him that way in the 40s and 50s, even as they understood that he had a certain conservatism in his soul.
So this project is not just a reframing of Hoover, looking at him through new perspectives, but you actually, you know, found a lot of, you know, sort of bombshell archival information about Hoover, especially regarding civil rights, Martin Luther King. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the sort of you know, archival process itself, and you know, maybe what surprising discoveries came out of it, and you know, maybe also what surprised you the most as you went through the life of Hoover?
Yeah, the research process really was fascinating and engaging to me throughout. And I worked on this for more than a decade, in part because there are so many surprises still out there. I would say the problem with a figure like Hoover in terms of research is that you have simultaneously too much information, right? That he was at the FBI as its chief for 48 years. It's a huge bureaucracy. He was a micromanager and he wanted everyone to write everything down. So it's just a crazy amount of information. I mean, there's no way that any historian will ever get through, you know, everything produced by Hoover or by the FBI during that period. And then on the other hand, because it's the FBI, there are a lot of things that you want to know that you're never going to know because they're secret, because they're still being redacted, or because you don't even know to ask for them, right? So we have the Freedom of Information Act, which is a great thing. It's a hugely powerful tool. But in order to file a Freedom of Information Act request, you have to know what you're asking for. And so if you don't know where to start, right, there are whole worlds of information that may still be inaccessible. One thing that was really fun about doing the project now is that both because of technology and then because of record releases and then just work done by other scholars, there are a whole host of new pools of records that have come out. So for his early life, some of the stuff that was the most interesting to me, I was able to access simply because, unlike biographers 30 years ago, you can run newspaper database searches. You can do a degree of genealogical research and kind of link things up that just would have been so labor intensive that it was almost impossible. So I found some early family scandals, his grandfather's suicide, his aunt's murder, right? All of these things that he had never spoken of, you wouldn't know to look for.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Hoover's early life. He kind of came from something of an unstable family background in a lot of ways. So what did, how did that inform Hoover the man, Hoover the public figure?
when he talked about his own childhood, he had a very sort of idealized, beautiful time of innocence, wonderful period of life. And when I actually then went and started doing some research, I found a much more complicated story. He came from a sort of middle-class family in Washington, D.C. His father was a government servant, and he came from a family that actually already had a real history in Washington, which is pretty unusual in the late 19th century. I mean, it's not a very big city, and the federal government doesn't employ that many people. But the Hoovers on both sides were already kind of in that world. But there were all of these kind of troubled moments. His earlier generations, had lots of early deaths, some suicides, some family scandals. During his childhood, his mother's brother's wife was murdered by her drunken lover and made headlines throughout the city. I think probably the most acute thing for Hoover was his own father's mental illness, which from this distance is a little bit hard to establish, but seems to have been something like severe depression. And Hoover seems to have responded to all of these trials and tribulations and the sort of uneasy and often, quote unquote, failed examples of the men in his family with a kind of huge drive to succeed, a sort of deep anxiety about, what it's like to be a man in the world and succeed and move forth. I mean, he was the valedictorian and the debate star and all of this, but there was a pretty deep anxiety under there as far as I could see.
And you mentioned that Hoover, by the end of his life, was really considered kind of to be a real, a really conservative figure, right? If not a conservative icon, then sort of definitely belonging in the camp of the right. So, what, if anything, can Hoover's life tell us about the rise of modern conservatism and particularly in its early stages in the 1970s, 1980s? What was the legacy of Hoover in that movement?
That was really, for me as a scholar, one of the sparks for doing this book. So when I was in graduate school in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the study of conservatism, of the right-wing movements was just coming into its own. There were lots of people thinking about it. And one of the things that struck me in looking at a figure like Hoover was that we were getting histories of grassroots movements. We were getting histories of political figures. We were getting civic organizations, etc. But that here was someone who was a deep and legendary conservative who actually spent his entire career embedded within the liberal state, right? And so what does it mean to think about someone who is building the state from within, not as, a New Deal liberal, though he shared certain elements of that, but as someone who was identified and would have described himself, I think, in many ways as a conservative. And so that's one of the big themes of the book. The period of the 60s and 70s, when the modern conservative movement is coming into being, I think he's an important figure for a couple of reasons. First of all, groups like the John Birch Society, the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade, right? These kind of grassroots anti-communist groups of the era, they love him, they revere him as kind of their one hero within the state. And actually, a lot of former FBI agents become very important right-wing figures on the lecture circuit, in kind of the right-wing media ecosystem as it's starting to emerge during those years. Hoover's a little ambivalent about them because he thinks some of them are nutcases and vigilantes and conspiracy theorists. And so he has his own conflicted relationship there. But I think most importantly, one of Hoover's greatest legacies, I think, was his attempt to discredit, surveil, disrupt, and really put up opposition to the movements of the left in the 1960s and 70s. And I think from his position of authority as a cultural figure at the FBI. He was very powerful in legitimizing those sets of ideas, whether it's about, Martin Luther King as a communist or the anti-war movement as being secretly in cahoots with the Soviet Union. And then, of course, he wasn't just a cultural figure. He was someone who was at the head of the federal government's domestic security apparatus. And so, he shaped and helped to disrupt a lot of those movements of the left. And so that's probably his most important legacy for the conservative movement, would be sort of weakening the opposition.
So here at the Luskin Center, we're particularly interested in thinking about ways that the study of history, the study of historical events, historical processes can inform the ways that we think about present day politics and policy. So in our own era, more recent era of Trump, of COVID-19, of Biden, that really sort of transforming and overhauling and rethinking what federal authority really is and how it operates. What lessons can we draw from Hoover's life and thinking about our time now and thinking about moving forward into the future?
One of the fascinating things that's happened in our own moment, really, since the Trump years, is, of course, that a lot of the partisan and ideological views of the FBI sort of flipped. Right? When Hoover died, he was beloved by the right, hated by the left, and by many liberals. And for a long time, if you looked at public opinion polls, Democrats, liberals, leftists would have said that they were suspicious of the FBI. The FBI was much less popular among those groups, and conservatives and Republicans really liked the FBI, law and order, security. And that has almost totally flipped now. And so, I think it accentuates what an interesting moment we're in. I think there are ways in which getting back to a more complicated view of Hoover that is a little before that moment gives us some glimmers of the fact that there had always been liberals who liked Hoover and the FBI. There were conservatives, particularly, kind of white nationalist, anti-federal, segregationist conservatives who were always suspicious of the FBI, and we're seeing those strains emerge now. And I think, Hoover also shows us the ways that a lot of the issues that the FBI is running into, accusations of being overly politicized, of being partisan, right? The ongoing investigations, both in terms of January 6th, but then still, kind of examining the FBI's record on the Russia investigations, et cetera. That a lot of those are sort of baked into the FBI's fundamental problem, which is it's supposed to be this nonpartisan agency that's constantly being pulled into these partisan fights. You're supposed to stand outside of politics, but you're in politics. And that was, Hoover's big challenge. He fought very, very hard to kind of hold on to this nonpartisan identity for the Bureau, because he understood if it came to be seen as just a partisan tool, then its legitimacy was gone. It didn't have any role to play, and it was just going to be kind of destroyed as an institution. And I think we're seeing a little of that playing out now.
Yeah, but before we go, what do you tell our listeners what you're working on now? What's coming next from you?
Well, since I spent more than a decade, mostly sitting alone in a room with documents, thinking about this strange man in order to write an 800-page book, I thought I would do something shorter as the next project, and something that's a little bit different. So what I'm doing right now is actually a short book in advance of 2026, which is going to be our 250th anniversary as a nation. That is trying to take up the question of whether Americans can face their past and still love their country. And so I'm going to a lot of historic sites at kind of key moments in the American past, looking at the ways they're trying to grapple with new understandings of history, taking on the question of whether there is, a national story that people agree on anymore. So that is a sort of short, relatively fun romp through American history. And then I think I'm going to turn back to another big giant project, and this time it will be about Ronald Reagan.
Okay, no, we're all very much looking forward to that. Well, Beverly, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. This was lots of fun.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.